Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Brookings. I'm Mike O'Hanlon with the Strobe Talbott Center on Security, Strategy, and Technology, as is Melanie Sisson, and we are honored and really just privileged, Congressman, to have the Honorable Adam Smith of the state of Washington here to join us today to discuss defense policy. Let me just give a brief word of introduction. We'll hear from the Congressman with a few of his thoughts to open up. Then we'll have a little conversation up here and look forward to you joining us with your questions in the last 20 minutes or so over the next hour. I think many of you know that Congressman Smith was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee for the last 4 years, a very important period spanning 2 presidencies, 2 national defense strategies, and a whole heck of a lot going on around the world. He's also now a member of Congress for 26 years running from the great state of Washington, 9th District. Before joining Congress, he was the youngest state senator in the country. Before that, he really lived and demonstrated the values that he tries to represent in Congress. I know every day, if you study his writings and read his bio and learn about the pride in his family from their working class roots and how he worked for UPS, going to Fordham, and later then went to law school and did a lot of important work in the state of Washington, really holding 2 jobs at the same time, one of them elected office before joining the House of Representatives after the 1996 elections. He's worked on the Foreign Affairs Committee and Intelligence and had a number of jobs on the House Armed Services Committee, where I trust, Congressman, you'll be remaining now as the ranking member, but I don't even know that for a fact. So that's
that's set now. The House approved that.
Great.
Just yesterday.
Oh, excellent. So with that news, please join me in welcoming Congressman Smith to Brookings.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I look forward to the discussion. Yes, very, very interesting times, but I think we do have a fairly coherent national security strategy at this point. The implementation will be the challenge, but I think you have to start with what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What do we want in terms of U.S. national security, and what do we want in the world? And what we want, and it's almost become cliche at this point, is a rules-based international order. We want a system that maximizes economic and political freedom, and that sets up a system to resolve our differences peacefully through international institutions. Now, there's a lot of stuff below that, but that's sort of the big picture. And from a national security perspective, we got to ask ourselves, what are the threats to that order, and/or to our internal security here in the U.S. And that threat environment is fairly well understood and has been for a while, even though it's evolving and growing in some ways. And that's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and global extremism, transnational terrorist groups. I've done this joke before panels before, but we came up with an acronym for that, CRINGE. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and global extremism. Credit to Baron Young-Smith, formerly on the HASC staff, who came up with that. But that's what we're looking at, and that group threatens us. And a lot of times people want to get into questions, well, which one's greater? How do you rank them? What order? And that is important in the sense of how do we deter each of those threats individually and figure them out. But overall, I think it's important to understand that the one thing all those folks have in common is they want to blow up that international order, and they want us out, down. Wherever you are in the world, China wants us out of Asia, Iran wants us out of the Middle East, Russia wants us out of Eastern Europe, and North Korea also wants us out of Asia, and of course the transnational terrorist groups want us out and gone, period. They want to reduce our influence and push us out because we are a threat to primarily their autocratic ambitions. And that's the threat environment that we have to be aware of. Now, how do we meet those challenges? Deterrence is going to be an incredibly important part of that. And we need to have a military that is strong enough to convince all of those groups that they're better off not attacking us or our allies. So that's certainly an important part of it. But a more important part of it, to my mind, is the partnerships. Is building the alliances globally and regionally that are necessary so we can work together with our allies and partners to achieve that end. And the other important piece of it is, even as I list those threat groups, when you have a nation like China and even to some degree Russia, our other goal is to get to the point where we're not in conflict. We don't want conflict here. China and Russia are both going to be major global powers going forward. That's not going to change. We just want to make sure that they are major global powers that are not threatening everybody else. That's what we want to work with. So while we're figuring out, and as this new China special committee that's being created is put in place, I think that's going to be one of their big challenges. We're not in a direct confrontation with China. We are strategic competitors, as I believe the name of the committee implies. How do we work through that? So that's sort of the overall environment. I would say just two more things before we get into the Q&A here. What's the biggest threat to our ability to achieve that? First of all, it's two things. One, we have to sell that narrative. Because I just said it in, 2-3 minutes, whatever it was, and it's in my head. Most Americans still ask questions like, why do we care what happens in Ukraine? Why do we care what China does with Taiwan? Why are we so involved and invested in conflicts across the world? We have to do a better job of making that case and giving that narrative to the American people so that they support those efforts and understanding within a lot of contexts, which I'm sure will come out in the question and answer period. So that's a big thing. And the second big threat to it is, we have to maintain our own representative government here at home. The threats that have happened to undermine U.S. democracy are real, and the rest of the world sees it. I mean, if I'm out there saying we are promoting more, economic and political freedom, well, I heard some people after what happened in Brazil a couple of days ago said, and sadly, one of the things the U.S. is exporting now is election denialism. That's a problem. It's a big problem, certainly domestically, if you want to maintain a representative form of government, but it's also a problem internationally if we're running around the world trying to work with our partners and talking to them about how we need to achieve, political freedom and economic freedom, and we seem to be questioning it at home. Now, knock on wood, I think the last election moved us in the right direction. I always like to quote Liz Cheney at this point, who after the election said it was a victory for Team Normal. And I think that was an exact way to sum it up. It wasn't all Democrats winning, certainly, and that's not what it's about. There were a lot of Republicans who won too, but by and large, the hardcore election-denying insurrectionists lost. Now, in many instances, they did not lose by as much as most of us would have liked, but one of my favorite expressions is, looks like a line drive in the box score. We won, and that's the important thing, and I think we moved that in the right direction. And then the last point, just a quick Pentagon point, that many folks have been writing about in terms of the policy we need to implement to put us in the best position to have that adequate deterrence within the Defense Department. We've really got to update the military to the modern fight. And the modern fight is information systems, first of all. So crucial. Information systems, missiles, drones, missile defense, and counter-drone. We have got to get better at those 5 things. Large platforms still have a place, but they are not as invulnerable as they used to be. And the lessons that we're learning from the fight in Ukraine need to be applied. And we're grinding our way in that direction. I'm disappointed in the last 2 years that we haven't been able to mothball more existing weapon systems, that we blocked the Pentagon, to my mind, in too many places. In terms of getting rid of cruisers and LCSs and B-1s and F-22s and C-130s and a whole bunch of other things. Mike Rogers, incoming chairman of the committee, and I are of one mind on this and are going to work together. We've got to be able to make sure that we're spending money where we need to spend it for the modern fight that we are now facing. And we got a lot of work to do on that. So obviously, a whole bunch more going on, but I want to get into the question and answer and dive into those details. Well, actually, I think it's worth having that discussion, and I will say that I met with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff this morning, and you will not be surprised to know that he doesn't actually agree with that. The notion that we need to get to a peaceful resolution in Ukraine, we can absolutely agree with. But there's one reason why we don't have a peaceful resolution in Ukraine, and that is because Russia doesn't want one, and Russia continues to bomb and attack. And I think presenting arguments like that simply adds fuel to Putin's fire and gives Russia, the blank check to go ahead and continue to commit the war crimes they're committing in Ukraine. So we want to get to a peaceful resolution. Russia does not. So step one in that is making Russia know they can't succeed, because Putin's shown he'll kill as many people as he has to if he thinks for 1 minute he can take over Ukraine. So what we are doing in defending and supporting the Ukrainian people is the best thing we can do to get to a peaceful outcome, the peaceful outcome that they claim they want. Just letting Putin roll over Ukraine and bomb it into oblivion and then move on to the next country, that's not going to bring about peace.
Thank you, and thank you for your exemplary way of handling contentious situations. I guess you've seen worse in your career.
I have. Yes.
I wanted to follow up on the national defense strategies and also pick up where you left off in your opening comments about some of the technologies that you'd like to see us emphasize more. And you gave a good list, which is a little bit different than the sort of cliched, hackneyed list that we often hear people espouse, however valid it may be, right. AI, hypersonic weapons, et cetera. You got a little bit more specific. I wondered if you wanted to just add any more thoughts on what kind of change to the U.S. military you'd like to see, let's say, by 2030. Any additional examples of where these 2018 and 2022 national defense strategies could be implemented to achieve the defense of the rules-based order and prepare for greater deterrence, better deterrence of Russia and China, the way you emphasized we must. So you talked about cyber, you talked about robotics, you talked about a number of other things. How would you like to see those implemented? What kind of alternative combat structures, what kind of alternative deployments around the world? I'm not asking for a comprehensive answer, but a couple more examples.
Well, no, but I think it starts with we have to create a Pentagon that better implements innovative technologies. Okay, and I think that's where it starts. All that stuff that you're talking about has very specific points and very specific answers. But the biggest impediment to it, and I seized upon this summary from an article in Foreign Affairs magazine 6 months ago, maybe longer now, that basically said that the Pentagon right now is set up to run like a 1950s car company, okay, when it needs to be set up to be run by like a 2022 technology company, like an Apple or a Google, that encourages more creativity. And there's a whole bunch of layers there that one would have to go down into. But you can think about the fact that in the 1950s car company, we're pretty much doing the same thing every day. We just need to do it as efficiently and as quickly as possible. You put that bolt there, you put the thing in, and then we have the product at the end of it. Whereas in an innovative economy, it's such a rapid pace of change. How do you identify new technologies? How do you encourage those new technologies? And how do you implement them? How do you make change? And the Pentagon is a slow-moving bureaucracy. And the DIU is actually a pretty good example of this in that Ash Carter set it up, and a very good idea, to make investments into new technologies, but it's R&D. So you got an idea for something that's going to solve a defense problem, you can get some money out of the DIU to do that, and that's great. But then when we get to the point where it's like, wow, okay, what you've developed, this is great, we want to buy this, we want to use this. Well, we got to wait for 2 years because of the whole, we don't have the right color of money here. We can't buy it, we got to go through a procurement process, and then you lose that innovative technology. Because in the rapid, fast-moving, innovative technology world, they don't have 2 years to wait before you buy their product, okay? Also, do we encourage creativity within those people who work at the Pentagon? Are they rewarded for going, you know what, I know I'm supposed to do it this way, but I think if we did it this way, we'd get there quicker and we'd solve the problem. Right now, you are not encouraged to think that way. You are encouraged to go, okay, here's the list. I have this standard joke that I make about this that I wish I could be like Thanos for 1 second, snap my fingers and make half of the requirements in the Pentagon go away. And I don't care which half, okay? Let's just start there and free up more people to make creative decisions. So that's not exactly what you were looking for in that, but that is the most important answer. And I mean, look, and when you get into a fight, like is happening in Ukraine, the creativity kicks in. Iran starts sending those drones over, and instantaneously, everyone's like, how do we take these things down? And they're not doing an RFP, and they're not doing a program of record, and they're not going, if it turns out that a shotgun can take these things down, then we're going to go buy 1,000 shotguns, and we're going to go do it. That's the type of creativity that needs to be in there on a regular basis. But to your point in terms of systems, it does come down to, obviously, we need more missiles and we need more missile defense systems. And there's nothing really terribly sophisticated about that. We just need to make them. And it does get sophisticated in terms of you need to make them better. You need to, if you have a better missile that's harder to shoot down, you need to make more of those. If the enemy has a better missile that's harder to shoot down, then you need to make something that's better at shooting it down. That's where a lot of the innovation is. And it's a transformation from massing a lot of firepower in one place to distributing that and increasing the lethality in that way. And that changes a lot of things. It doesn't mean that we don't need aircraft carriers or we don't need F-35s. We might need fewer of them. They might not be as necessary in as many places, but we need to start thinking in those terms. And one final thing in the comment, because I think as I was talking about the narrative, the protesters and the statement they made, one of the things that we have to deal with within the narrative is that for the last 20 years, the U.S. has been engaged in a lot of fights. Afghanistan, Iraq, what we used to refer to as the global war on terror. The decisions that were made in all of those things weren't all outstanding, okay? And we kind of have to own that. I'm always for sort of a humble confidence, if you will, which is to say that we acknowledge our mistakes. We're not coming at this as you're either with us or you're against us, or America first, or we know better. We're the best, most exceptional country in the world, so therefore you have to do what we say. I think we can all sort of put that to bed. We all make mistakes. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Let's acknowledge those and let's work in a partnership to build a better world in a cooperative way. And I think it's really important because the partnerships that we're going to need to build in the Middle East, in Asia, and I've traveled all over the world last year meeting with a bunch of countries. When you go to a country and say, we don't want you to do business with China, okay, because here's what China's going to do, blah, 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 they're going to be like, okay, but we got to live in this neighborhood, all right? How do we work with you and with them? There's a whole bunch of things we need to do to be just a little bit more humble about the approach we take to playing the role in the world that I still believe, U.S., we absolutely have to play that role. A lot of people look at some of those mistakes in the last 20 years and say, let's go back into the shell. We can't do that. The world will not be better off if we do that, and we certainly will not be better off if we do that. We just have to do it in a more intelligent, as I say, more humble way.
So thank you. A lot of really thoughtful approaches to strategy there. I wanted to ask how we're going to pay for the innovation and the new capabilities if we have to tighten belts more. And you've been, if you don't mind my saying, and reflecting back on your chairmanship and your previous service, you've been very interesting to watch on the fiscal front because notwithstanding what was said earlier, you've never wanted to just throw money at the Pentagon. You've always been cognizant of the need for fiscal responsibility, and you've had to rely on American domestic needs. And so for all those reasons, and because now of the shift of power in Congress and other trends, there's a distinct possibility we won't keep seeing these big increases in the defense budget. So I guess my question is twofold. One, why did you go along with the budget increases of recent years, which were even more typically than, let's say, President Biden requested? But two, if we have to tighten belts, is the kind of list of economies that you mentioned earlier where we should look? In other words, you mentioned older systems we should retire, or do you have any more radical ideas? For example, certain kinds of weapons are altogether unnecessary. It sounds like you want to keep some aircraft carriers, some F-35s, et cetera, but I wondered if you had any other reforms or economies to add to the list that you already mentioned.
Well, I would say the biggest one off the top is let's get rid of the systems that the Pentagon wants to get rid of. Okay, and that is the continuous fight that we have over the systems that I listed earlier. You can save a lot of money if we get rid of those systems. I think you could absolutely do that. But then also, those basic procurement reforms that I described. Taking a problem-solving approach instead of a requirements program of record approach can save an enormous amount of money. But overall, I think the approach should be, let's look at the budget we have and then what we need to do and look at it from a cost-effective manner. I think part of the problem and the biggest argument that I've made consistently over the last 4 years, and I'll address your issue on how I voted on those budgets in a second, is if you look at it and go, we need more money, well, then you're just going to throw more money at it. If you look at it and say, this is what you got, okay, make the best of it. And I used this line many times before. I had a VC tell me one time that he has not yet seen the entity that can't be cut by 10% and get better at what they do. okay? If I say that to anybody at the Pentagon, they're like, and do I believe that we could cut the Pentagon 10% and they could get better at what they do? Yeah, actually I do. Might not happen, but it's at least possible. But you need to get into that mindset, okay? Not, oh my gosh, we have a problem, please give me another check. And believe me, it ain't just the Pentagon that looks at the world this way, okay? I've been dealing with public policy for 32 years, and that's always the approach, We don't have enough resources. The world is what it is, okay? And in the world, there's a finite amount of resources, unless you happen to be Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. For the most part, anything you're trying to do in this world, you got a finite amount of resources. And where you get really good at it is when you accept that. And you say, I'm going to make the best of what I have. So I don't have, other than what I've listed, which is not insignificant, but just look at it that way. We have to live with $800 billion. Can we do it? Absolutely we can. And then you got all the partners. There's other people out there who are now starting to step up because the threat from Russia and China has become very real after Ukraine and after what the threats that Xi has been making to Taiwan. So you've got countries like Japan. They're in town this week. I was in Japan a couple months ago. They're taking this very seriously. They're figuring out how they can build up their defenses. Australia, which until a couple years ago was like, I know you say China's bad, but we're going to work with them. And then you had that whole COVID thing. I find this is just fascinating. It's amazing how you can screw things up with just the tiniest little thing. So Australia, and literally this is all they did, I don't know, somewhere in the middle of the COVID pandemic, they said, China, look, you're not being terribly transparent here. And it would be really helpful to us dealing with this pandemic if you kind of let us know what's going on. And China was like, you will not do that. They put full-on trade war on them. They went after the beef. They went after all this other stuff. And Australia was like, oh my God, we can't deal with these people. So we better make contingency plans. And that's happening. So we can build those partnerships in order to meet those threats as well. So you ask me on a campaign, would I rather have an extra $1 million? Most of the time, I'm going to say yes. But you're not, in many instances, going to have that. So live with what you've got and really focus on the question. Instead of spending all your energy saying, how can I suck another $20 billion out of people? Now, I had that argument. I made that argument. I lost that argument in committee on the floor. And I do believe that we need a defense budget. We do. Do I think that defense budget probably should have been 820 instead of 858 or whatever it wound up being? Sure. But I've used this line many times here recently. I believe in democracy more than I believe in my own opinion. Which, by the way, is something that a lot of folks on the far right and the far left could take to heart. You don't always have to get your way for a whole bunch of different reasons, but one of them is you might be wrong, okay? That's the whole wisdom of crowds thing. That's the whole point of democracy, is to have a whole bunch of different voices. You don't have to burn the house down just because they didn't give you what you wanted. It might be okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very good. One more question on strategy, then I want to ask about military people and readiness, the state of the force, and then maybe I'm going to press you briefly on Russia to ask you to expand a little further before handing off to Melanie for some questions I know she's got on China, and then to the audience. So in the Pentagon, as they've tried to figure out ways to achieve the national defense strategies of 2018 and 2022, the Mattis and Austin strategies, and surprising amount of agreement, as Colin Call said on this stage a couple months ago to us, they've come up with a lot of different buzzwords, alphabet soup, acronyms, initiatives, and a lot of them sound good. Some of them mean something. Some of them sometimes overwhelm you with just the, numbers of letters and abbreviations. And I wondered if there's anything you want to give a shout out to in terms of the various innovation efforts that are underway now. And I'll just list a few possibilities, but you can choose from this list or some other list. There's obviously the Marine Corps trying to get lighter, more maneuverable, Force Design 2030. There's the so-called Joint All-Domain Command and Control, JADC2, which is trying to build, of course, a more integrated communications sharing, information sharing network across services, which is always a priority, but always hard to do. There are initiatives by the Air Force to disperse its basing throughout the broader Indo-Pacific. There are the European Deterrence Initiative and Pacific Deterrence Initiative efforts, which are designed to try to, again, more generally disperse our bases. And then the last one I'll mention is a multilateral effort. Well, two of them, the AUKUS agreement with Australia and the UK, and then the Quad a more informal arrangement with India, Japan, and Australia to just expand our cooperation and push back against China. So some of those are more Pentagon nitty-gritty programmatic. Some of those are more about foreign policy. Anything that strikes you as the most important or worthy of an extra boost?
Well, I think that's actually a really good summary, both of the strategy and of all of the steps that are being taken to implement it. And I think it's worth saying the president, and his team are doing what they need to do, and they have the right strategy. And I agree with all that list. I mean, the couple of things that I would highlight are one that you didn't mention, but is sort of similar, is the space architecture. And the idea of having a more distributed system that doesn't focus on just a couple of exquisite satellites, has a more distributed network. I think that's going to be crucial in terms of our communications ability, which is going to be crucial, and that feeds into the JADC2 thing, which is the whole ballgame. I mean, situational awareness in the Ukraine-Russia fight is the whole thing, and we saw that, with the most recent strike on the Russian barracks that was so devastating because they were using their cell phones. Well, part of it was because they were using their cell phones, but part of it because Ukraine had the setup so they could take advantage of that. So those, I think, would be absolutely the key. And then one other thing that I would mention on the B-21 program, and I don't understand all the ins and outs of this, but basically, if you look at the way the F-35 was set up and implemented and the way the B-21 was, that difference is one of the keys to us being able to make this work with less money than we would like. Whatever that number is. The B-21 has been a much more efficient, effective, on time, on budget. They've built competition into it. They've avoided vendor lock to a very large degree. I would say that the Sentinel, the GBSD program, I think is similarly efficient. I don't think we necessarily need it, but again, I lost that argument, and I am unlikely to ever win that argument. But if we're going to build it, we may as well build it in a more efficient and effective way. So implementing those strategies in terms of how you build weapon systems to get them closer to on time and on budget. In fact, I was telling the story. I was walking into a B-21 brief some time ago, and I happened to walk by a colleague of mine. Yeah, what's going on? I said, well, I'm going to this B-21 brief, and I joked and said, and I'm sure, they're going to tell me that it's going great. It's on time, it's under budget. I laughed because I don't think I'd ever walked into a briefing like that over the course of the last 50 years. Everything seemed to be like, well, it's just a software problem. We're working on it, whether it's the tanker or the F-35 or whatever. But I walked into the B-21 brief, and it was all good. So, progress can, in fact, be made.
Awesome. I would like to ask you about military families, and if you want, you can weave in a comment on veterans, too. I know this group is near and dear to your heart, and you've been their champion as chairman and member throughout your career. What's the state of the all-volunteer force and the families behind them, and how worried are you about the recruiting problems that we've seen develop these last couple of years?
Yeah, I actually had a very good conversation with both Secretary Austin and Chairman Milley just this morning on this subject. First of all, there is a lot of good news in terms of the support that we've given to military families. Certainly on the veteran side, the PACT Act makes a huge difference in terms of making the investment in veterans. And in this last cycle, we had good pay raise, but we also had an increase in the number of people who could meet the basic needs allowance if they need access to that, increased housing allowance, and a variety of other steps to help meet the needs of the service members and their families. But we definitely at this point have a recruitment problem. We've got a plan to deal with it, and I think one of the biggest things to remember, the biggest reason we have a recruitment problem is because 2 years of pandemic. They haven't been able to recruit in the same way that they traditionally recruit over the last of the 2 years. As Secretary Austin told me today, they haven't been in high schools, literally, for 2 years. Okay, they haven't been able to go out there and do that recruitment. I think they're stepping back up and they're doing that in a very effective way. But it's a challenge. And I know also incoming Chairman Rogers, this is his top priority. How do we meet those recruitment and retention goals? And we definitely will need a plan to try and step up and deal with that, because right now it continues to be a problem.
Do you feel like the plan that's been developed in recent years to try to improve the readiness of equipment and the overall availability of airplanes and ships has really borne fruit? I mean, there were really concerns 5-7 years ago about the force being worn down. Is it looking better to you in terms of readiness?
We still got a long way to go, but we are starting to better understand those systems and have a better plan for going forward. And by the way, AI and software systems are a huge part of that. And this is how we're going to finally get to a full audit of the Pentagon to understand sort of, what all do we have. I a few years ago now, Palantir got a contract, was working on a system just to let the Army know who's working for you and where are they on a given day, okay? Because they didn't used to know that. A little niche here, a little niche there. You had like 1,000 different systems. So they pulled all those systems together, and now if you have access, you can go on a software system and you can go, here's who we got, here's who's on sick leave and all that. So that sort of integration, the same can be done with maintenance, to understand, okay, this, I don't know, I'm not an engineer or a mechanic or anything like that, but this bolt is getting ready to die, so we'll fix it now. And that all is part of what AI and machine learning can do to put you in a better position to do that in a cost-effective manner.
So my last question, and then Melanie, I know, wants to follow up with some of her own, has to do with Russia and Ukraine. And you mentioned earlier the importance of making sure Putin doesn't win. But I wanted to ask you to take out your crystal ball a little bit and at least offer some conjecture on where this debate needs to possibly go in 2023. And specifically, do we need to just keep the spigot open as much as possible for Ukraine and maybe even accelerate the provisioning of equipment and maybe even think about things like tanks at a more substantial level than we have so far? But then the other part of the question, at some point in 2023, do you anticipate the possibility that we should really be asking President Zelensky to think about some form of negotiation where he doesn't get all of his territory back immediately, where maybe there are concepts like shared sovereignty or long-term referenda or something else that, as unbecoming as it may be to say or to contemplate, where Putin's aggression is not completely reversed, but nonetheless some kind of a stable peace perhaps can be created rather than keep fighting this thing year after year. I know it's too soon to probably you're going to say to give a definitive answer, but I'd like to get your thoughts.
And again, dealing with our friends from earlier, it's a bit of a myth that those conversations aren't taking place. Chairman Milley, Secretary Austin, a whole bunch of people are regularly having conversations with our Ukrainian counterparts. They're also now, there was a brief gap in that, having conversations with their Russian counterparts and having conversations about this. But understand that right now, Putin has decided that he is just going to keep going forward, and his maximalist goals have not changed. If those maximalist goals change, then we can start having a wide variety of conversations. But right now, and it's wrong to say that the choice that you just described, painful though it may be, of letting Russia keep parts of Ukraine, it's not even on the table. Okay, it's not there to be talked about because Russia's not interested in it. So right now, the first step we have to do is, again, stop them. And I actually think Ukraine is having more success on that front than people popularly understand. And they've pushed back, they've taken territory. I think they're in good shape. And yes, we're going to need to continue to support them through the spring, while continuing to have conversations about what that future might look like. But step one here, again, is convincing Putin that he can't have what he wants, which is a completely subjugated and taken over Ukraine. And that is still going to take some work. And it's sad and it's terrible and it's horrible. And anyone who says that we're excited because, Russia's engaged in this war is an idiot. Okay? And I'll say that bluntly. We are not. If this war could stop tomorrow, I don't think there's a single solitary person who wouldn't sign up for that. But Putin made his choice. What we're trying to do is to make sure that he stopped.
Thank you. Melanie.
Great, thanks. Well, Congressman, I'm going to echo Mike's gratitude for you being here and point out that at Brookings we very much value clarity, composure, and good humor. So thank you for arriving with an abundance of all three today. It's much appreciated. Now that we've looked inside the Pentagon a bit, I actually want to sort of reverse us back to where you started the conversation and pull back out and situate what it is that the Pentagon is doing within the larger context of national security and the national security strategy, and in particular, the relationship between the United States and China. You mentioned the perspective that China, Russia, Iran, others are invested in and actively trying to break the international rules-based order that has been in place in the post-World War II era. I'm curious in particular about China. Do you think that that is where the vision ends? Is it just to break the system, or do you have a view on what China's vision for world order is?
Well, I think it comes I wouldn't be so blunt as to say, yeah, that's where it ends. But it's certainly where it starts, and it's certainly about 75% of it. that, they just don't like the fact that the U.S. and sometimes the Western world, sometimes a broader array of the world, it's wrong to refer to it as the Western world because Japan, Australia, there's a whole bunch of countries not in the Western world who are part of that. I think they view that as restricting their ability to do what they want to do. And understand, this whole fishing thing, which people don't talk a lot about, China's violating the territorial waters of countries all around the world and overfishing areas and doing stuff. They basically want greater freedom to do what they want to do without someone looking over their shoulder and saying, no, you can't do that. That is a huge part of it. I think their broader vision is, as so many countries in the world view, as we sometimes fall to, and that gets back to my let's be humble instead of exceptional, and we'll have a better role in the world. I think, you can pick, a dozen different countries in the world at one time or another had fairly sizable empires. There's always some moron within those countries who's like, oh, it'd be great if we were back when the Persian Empire ruled the world, or the Roman Empire, or the Greek Empire. And it's like, yeah, that's not really particularly helpful. And I think there's a big part of that in China, all right? The whole century of humiliation. Okay. We're all going to get humiliated at one time or another. Let's not make it our life plan to sort of avenge that, because all kinds of bad things are going to happen if you do. And by the way, that's an individual thing as well as a nation thing. But I think China is very much in that. And that's, Xi's built up this image, he's done that whole thing. So I think it's part of it. China should rule the world because we're a big power. And they are. They're big, they're powerful, they're great. But nobody should rule the world. We all got to figure out how to get along. So they're struggling, mightily to be more modest in that approach. And then to the extent they had anything sort of specifically on the table, it would be, it's not our place to tell other countries how to run their business. So we're not going to, we're not going to care about human rights. We're not going to do this stuff. I have a friend of mine, dealing with Cambodia, one of those countries that's sort of caught in the middle. And, their complaint to us is, China, all money, no judgment. U.S., no money, all judgment. And I think that's a decent summary. And I would say that maybe we can sort of even that out a little bit. But China's vision of, no judgment whatsoever, no matter what you do, no matter how you treat your people, we're just going to, look the other way all the time. I think that sort of passes for what their vision is. And it's extraordinarily problematic, and we need to push back against it. But on the other hand, they're not nihilists, okay? They're not suicidal. You can't rule over a world that's completely destroyed. Game of Thrones analogy in there about ruling over the ashes or whatever. We all know how that turned out. Well, actually, if you didn't watch the series, you don't. But anyway, so they are a rational actor that we can work with on a very reasonable basis, and that's going to be the trick and the key is how do we find those ways to work? And that we don't get into no, we should rule the world. No, we should rule the world. Okay, let's just chill and let's figure out how we can work together to have some sort of semblance of peace and stability for all of us.
On that note, can I ask again about the Select Committee on China that has just been formed?
Sure.
Do you think that what you have just described is identifying ways for the United States and China to work productively insofar as we can and to deal with the places in which we can't in ways that are constructive rather than conflictual? Is that sort of the operating model that you envision for that committee? Or stated alternatively, what is your hope for what it is that the committee will do and produce?
Yeah, let me come at it this way, because my hopes and my visions aren't necessarily the most relevant thing in this conversation. What's actually going to happen, I think, is the key. And I think it's to be determined. And we're right now talking about, who should be the Democrat, ranking member on that committee, what members should be part of it. And starting some preliminary conversations with Congressman Gallagher about what his vision and where he wants to take that. And it can go in, a couple different directions. And, I think it could be incredibly productive because strategic competition is going to be very important on a whole series of different realms. Or it could just become a China bashing exercise. Now, I have worked, with Congressman Gallagher for a while. He is a very smart, very serious person. And that gives me, cause for optimism that he wants to take this in the right direction. On the other hand, I think, I'm surprised at times some of the people who just fall into full-scale China bashing. and talk about how terrible China is on this, how we can't let them do this. We have to stand up against them on every single turn. I think of Congressman Waltz when I think of that. I also like him, also work with him, but he's kind of belligerent about these things. And the world has to be big enough for the both of us. And we can look at China and we can say, well, you shouldn't be doing this, and you shouldn't be doing that, and we're going to force you to stop. Yeah, we're not, actually. So where does that go? I think it's TBD. Gallagher's going to have a lot to do with that, but then also there are other members of his caucus who are going to influence that process as well. It's crucial that we have that committee. Voted for it yesterday, despite some people's misgivings. Really important that we have that conversation on the legislative side, but it could absolutely go sideways in a way that creates more conflict than it solves.
I'm going to pull together two sort of non-obvious thematic elements of the conversation so far, which happen to be humility and military technology. I'm curious about your view on the technology export regime, those export controls that the administration placed on China in October. With the metaphor of a tall fence around a very small yard, focusing on semiconductor and computing technologies that are important to military advances. Putting aside, you're welcome to comment on the substance of the export controls.
Sure.
I'm interested in your view about how that fits in the broader construct of the U.S.-China relationship, but also how it relates to the entirety of the bilateral, multilateral economic relationships and alliances and partners and allies that are affected by those export controls.
Yeah, I'll hit the more inflammatory part of this second, just to give you something to look forward to. But the first part of it is it absolutely makes sense to begin to look to be less reliant on China for so much manufacturing. Because starting in the late 90s and moving forward, China became the corporate easy button all over the world, okay? It's where everybody wanted to go. Massive market, obviously, low-cost labor, no environmental restrictions, and we started making a whole lot of stuff in China. And by we, I mean the globe, not necessarily the U.S. And I understand why it was. And so we got to the point where we was definitely listing in that direction. And I think a huge part of strategic competition is the globe needs to become less dependent upon China. I mean, putting aside for the moment, China's, more problematic behavior, it's not that good to be that wholly dependent on any one country in any scenario, and it doesn't have to be that way. And we're starting to see this happen. Certainly domestic U.S., stuff on, printed circuit boards and the CHIPS Act and all sort of stuff. But also, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, Latin America in general. There are a lot of other places, particularly now that China, their cost of living has gone up, so that absolutely needs to happen. But I have a very strong bias that is highly unusual for someone on the Armed Services Committee, and that is that we place too much emphasis on trying to not share. And the notion that, we have this, we have the leadership here, and as long as we just hold on to it and make sure that nobody ever sees it, then we'll be fine. I don't know. I kind of think China could have figured out a lot of this stuff on their own. Not to say they didn't steal a bunch of it. I understand that. But if we overemphasize making sure that we have these export restrictions, we hamper our ability to build the relationships we need to build. So one of the big problems right now with Australia and with other countries in particular, AUKUS is a great idea. It's got a lot of promise. It could also, we got to share stuff. If we're going to be able to be effective in building those partnerships, we are not going to be able to make absolutely everything that we need in the United States of America. Not going to happen. It's a global economy, is what it is, and until we have one of those post-apocalyptic moments, it's going to be. So we need other countries, all right? And if we keep telling them, no, we're not going to share this with you, we're not going to share that with you, you can't see this, you can't see that, it's going to make that really hard. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to have CFIUS and all these other rules to restrict it, but we've got to be more broad in how we look at it and see that if we're restricting that ability, we're restricting partnerships, and the other thing we're doing is we're making harder for domestic U.S. companies to either maintain or in some cases obtain leadership in those areas because they're cut off from markets. And gosh, you go into those export controls. I mean, yeah, I know you shouldn't be selling nuclear launch codes or whatever, but there's times when the restrictions are such that if you have like a bolt that happens to go into a military thing, and then it goes over here. Well, you can't sell it over here because it goes over there. And then people say, okay, I'm not manufacturing in the U.S. I got to get the hell out of here so I can sell my stuff to the people who want to buy it. So I think we need to balance those things.
I'm going to take the prerogative of one last question before we move on to the audience. And it probably won't surprise you that I'm going to ask about Taiwan and U.S. policy to do with Taiwan. I think it's pretty standard fare in Washington these days to hear people assert very strongly that we must deter China from acting forcibly against Taiwan, to which you can always say, yes, I like ice cream also. It is not a controversial position. Where things get interesting is in thinking about how we ought to go about doing that. From what you've seen in the National Defense Strategy, in the changes the services are undertaking, in modernization efforts, how do you think that we are doing in terms of aligning ourselves well to be able to deter Beijing, not just in the military domain, unless you think it is an exclusively military problem, but within the rubric of integrated deterrence, all of those sort of operating together? Are we in better shape today to deter that use of force than we were 4 years ago?
Let me answer the question. I think we're in a lot better shape than most people think. I think there's a lot of hand-wringing and worry. We tend to make our enemies 10 feet tall and imagine that they're capable of all manner of things, and we're helpless in the face of that. And I don't believe that is the case, because the number one, approach on deterrence is to make China think that if they attack Taiwan, it will not go well for them, that it will be a net loss and, well, to use the phrase we're using on Russia and Ukraine, a strategic failure. And I think we're doing a better job of that than people realize. Part of that is having an adequate military deterrence, and we're working with Taiwan, to make sure that they're able to do that, and that we have assets and we have partners. So I think we are doing better than people realize. In fact, I think there was just a war game finally came out that said, yeah, if China goes into Taiwan, they're going to lose. We'd heard so much about the sort of the opposite side of that argument. And I think we need to deliver that message consistently to China. Don't do this. It will not end well, because our goal is to make sure that they don't do it, so that we don't have the conflict that would come. And then again, not to keep leaning so heavily on this point, the partnerships are really important. I think China's belligerence towards Taiwan, towards the region, is beginning to have a negative effect. I mentioned the Australia example. Certainly Japan has started to step up and be more concerned. You've got the Philippines. Duterte was a weird dude, so it was hard to tell what he was thinking or doing. But Marcos is no particular friend of the United States for obvious reasons. But he is mindful of the threat that the bully next door has, and is looking for partners. And so are a number of other countries in the region. If China starts to see that too is part of that integrated deterrence, that they're like, maybe our belligerence is not actually serving our own best interests here. And that's where we get to a better place.
Great. Well, thank you. Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you now to manage the questions.
Great. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Please wait for a microphone, identify yourself, and we'll take 2 questions at a time. Maybe we'll start over here with the 2 against the wall, please.
Thank you, Congressman, for your comments here today. My name is Amy Nelson. I'm a scholar here at Brookings. I know you were very supportive of the New START extension when the question was raised. Obviously, this is a really difficult time for arms control, from the demise of the ABM treaty to the CFE treaty to Open Skies, INF. We're facing a lot of arms control problems. My question for you is, what's next for New START, and what's next more broadly for arms control?
And I think we're going to take 2, if I heard correctly.
Right.
So I'll
please
put a pen in.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an author and an editorial contributor to the Hill newspaper. And first, thank you for beginning your presentation by setting the stage at the level of theory, understanding that the purpose of our defense is to preserve a rules-based order, and to deal with threats to that order is important for the question that I'm hoping you can help give us a better understanding on. Since the Nixon Doctrine in 1969, every U.S. administration, from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, from Donald Trump to Jimmy Carter, has said our allies need to do more. You're getting rich. This is no longer post-war. You're rich. You should do more. No president has really dealt with, probably Nixon came closest to saying why, because what Nixon, at least at the level of rhetoric, said is, so we can do less. You do more, we'll do less, and we'll all be better off. Since then, the general rhetoric is, you should do more, and then we'll think about what impact it has on the global environment. But no commitments, you need to do more, period. The most recent iteration of this in the last 20 years has been burden sharing, and the result of burden sharing is we'll have to see where we are when burden sharing is underway, and it's now obviously underway. Germany and Japan have announced major increases in their defense spending. So the question I'm hoping you can help explain is there a relationship between what we now call burden sharing or increased spending on the part of our allies and the U.S. level of spending? Because there's been a recent variation of this which says that if they do more, we need to do more.
Yeah,
we can't be left behind. If they're doubling their defense spending, we need to double ours. So is there a relationship?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So to your question first, the number one biggest thing that we need to do on arms control is start talking, okay? Because the big challenge, China has never wanted to talk to us about this stuff because they were trying to catch up. Russia obviously got their issues. I think we need to be passionately in favor of dialogue. And the idea that, Russia, China, U.S., none of us want to destroy the planet, okay? Not the objective. And there are a whole lot of new weapon systems being developed with new capabilities that have all manner of implications for this sort of balance that we were able to achieve with the former Soviet Union. Let's start talking. Now, where those talks go, I don't know. But just getting over that threshold, because it's still a debate around here. Chairman Milley, has gotten chewed out for calling up the Chinese defense minister. Of course he's calling up the Chinese. He has to. So let's put that idiocy aside and say, let's start talking. Because all three countries have weapons that would already scare the living hell out of people. And if they knew what was really going on, it would scare them even worse. Let's start talking about how we can have our competition without destroying the planet. So that's number one. As far as the burden sharing issue is concerned, I never particularly liked the whole frame of that conversation. And obviously nobody, really sort of personified that mistaken approach more than Donald Trump, who basically had the opinion of, what do they do for us? We do everything for them. They do nothing for us. Screw them. We shouldn't be giving them all this money. The post-World War II order that we enforced, and we spent more money on it, no question about it, we also benefited more than anybody else in the world. And it's not even frickin' close, okay? 4% of the world's population, 20%, of world consumption, okay? I mean, look at what we've been able to generate here through that world order. So, we're not doing South Korea a favor, okay? We are pursuing our strategic interests by providing them with the resources necessary to make sure that North Korea doesn't invade and blow up the whole frickin' world, okay? So I've never accepted the idea that, the rest of the world isn't putting enough into the pot. I've always sort of felt like the rest of the world can go, wait a second, how come you got all the stuff? Which is a bit of an exaggeration, I'll grant you, but I think it is more than benefited us. As far as what's happening right now, again, burden sharing is the wrong way to put it. We want to get them all invested in the idea that this world is in their interests. And I think you're starting to see it happen. I actually, President Biden has, I think, had a lot of success. And obviously, what Russia did in Ukraine, what China has started to say in Taiwan is driving a lot of that. But I think that's the way to look at it. We have a distinct interest here. And then, we got a whole bunch of people involved, who does what, I'm not going to be terribly hung up on one specific, dollar figure one way or the other. So let's look at burden sharing as sort of a shared responsibility to get to a global place and understand the U.S. is doing just fine. No one's been taking us, in any way. We're benefiting from this.
Well, time for one last round. So let's take two more questions, please. And let me geographically disperse across the crowd. So we'll take the gentleman here, just to your right, and then over here with the tie as well. please.
Hello, my name is Andrew. I'm a Forensic Advisory Associate at KPMG. And my question is regarding what you mentioned earlier about innovation within the department and how it should be run more like a tech company. So how can partners in industry help with that process and help with innovation in the department?
Thank you. And then over here, please, for the last question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much. Alan Hester, Friends Committee on National Legislation here. Two quick crystal ball questions for you. Likelihood of the 2002 Iraq AUMF being repealed this year, and then what is the likelihood of Congress finding itself debating $1 trillion defense budget this year?
Yeah. I'll start there and then come back to the tech question in a second. I think it's highly unlikely we're going to be looking at $1 trillion defense budget this year. I mean, the biggest challenge we have in that regard is just to have a budget, okay? Because and I'm not supposed to use that word, what word? The legislative hostage takers, let's just go with that, don't seem to care if the federal government functions. So on the debt ceiling and on the appropriations bills, they have shown a willingness to take hostages and a certain enthusiasm for executing those hostages, whether necessary or not. And that's going to be a challenge. So I don't think we're headed up towards $1 trillion. And the O2A, you hit upon a sore subject on the O2A UMF. We ought to repeal the damn thing, okay? And I'll tell you, and I won't give you the inside story here, but I was trying to do something else that we actually wound up doing, and the Pentagon was objecting to it. And the person I was talking to said, well, our lawyers say, and I said, well, let me just cut you off right there, okay? Because I am a lawyer. I'm not a very good lawyer. I haven't practiced much, but I remember law school. Lawyers will always say, well, if you do this, all these kind of terrible, horrible things could happen, all right? So if we're listening to the lawyers, we're never going to do anything, all right? And the lawyers are like, well, if we repeal it, screw that. Okay, if Congress can't repeal an AUMF that was specifically passed to take out Saddam Hussein 20 years after the guy's in the grave, then we're not doing our job, okay? And you can give me all the legal crap about what the Pentagon can and can't do because of all this. No, get rid of it. Whether or not we will, highly unlikely. I've had that argument, and I've gone up against these people, and I've lost every time, and I don't see any reason that's going to change this year. But I will try. As far as the technology companies, the biggest thing is engage in the defense world. Stay engaged in the defense world. And I know that can be frustrating because of the thing I said earlier about how it's really hard once you have something that the Pentagon, even if the Pentagon says they want it. I mean, just up front, finding the people you need to talk to make your pitch is difficult. But even if they say they want it, then actually getting them to buy it can be really, well, it's vastly more cumbersome than if you were selling it in the private market. But stay engaged. Be a little bit patriotic and also understand that at the end of the day, there are benefits there. And I think, not to mention Palantir twice in the same session, but Palantir didn't start off with the best relationship with the Pentagon. They started off, as many companies do, suing them, and with good reason. But now, now they're integrated, and I think they would tell you they're benefiting a lot from that relationship. Certainly, they're providing an enormous service, which they are being well compensated for. But they're also benefiting from learning, and that has applications on the commercial side. There's a lot of great stuff going on in the defense sector that, whether you're talking about space, whether you're talking about AI, machine learning, that has, crossover implications. Stay engaged. And then what we're going to work on our end, and really the key here and the whole creative, tech company versus auto company is got to have a problem-solving mentality. And that's the way I describe it. Not a requirements, not a please tell me all the steps that I must take that will guarantee me the right outcome. Tell me what your problem is, and then I'll close with my favorite, the Princess Bride analogy. What are my assets? What are my liabilities? Okay? And you can say, here's what I'm trying to do. What do I got? And then you just let me use it. Don't tell me I got to do this and this and this and this and talk to these people and those people. Just here's what I'm trying to do. Here's my tools. Let me go solve the problem. The Hacking for Defense folks up at Stanford are doing really cool stuff on this with undergraduates. Granted, they're Stanford undergraduates, but really smart kids, and they give them a real-world Pentagon problem. And they say, solve it. And the fascinating thing about that, is that every one of these groups that I talked to of students said, the first thing we realized is that the question they asked us wasn't actually the problem they needed to solve, okay? Here's what you really need to do, and then they went after it. Whereas, go back to the Pentagon, and in the bad situation, they would have just spent, I don't know, 10 years and a couple $1 billion trying to solve the problem that they knew wasn't the one they were supposed to try and solve in the first place, okay? Got to be able to innovate, solve problems, use the assets at your disposal to solve them. And I think tech companies can be great at helping the Pentagon understand that and do that.
My friend, what a tour de force. Thank you, and please join me, everyone, in thanking the chairman.